Let us hope and trust, let us watch If you would look at Genesis chapter 6, specifically verse 22. Genesis chapter 6, verse 22. After Noah is given all of the commands of what God desires for him to build in this ark, it says, "Thus Noah did, according to all that God had commanded him, so he did." Look down into chapter 7, look at verse 5, after he's been given more instruction and command. It says, "Noah did according to all that the Lord had commanded him." Why did Noah never give up? He had faith in God. Salvation for his family. He knew his life depended on it. And to realize this was him responding to the covenant of God that God had given. It came with human responsibility of what he had to do and respond to. Is this the same kind of seriousness we take with the new covenant that we share in Christ? Do we really think that way of going, my life depends on it, my family's life is affected by this? To go, do we trust him and his promises and his covenants? And to really think in those terms of going, I can choose to go my own way or I can choose life with him. And you see something about Noah that he is not going to give up. He is not going to swerve away from that. As we went through last week and talked about how that Noah and his wife and his 3 sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth, and their 3 wives, are all on the ark for 365 days. Just in your imagination, what do you imagine they thought about? I know it'll be a wide spectrum of things, but what do you imagine in all that time of being there? What do you consider that they thought about? All right, when's this going to be over? They don't have the timetable going in, do they? What else? Richard?
I was thinking about this last week. It's hard, although God instructed him to do something that was quite big. You know, a big ship, he's got to build, you know, he's got to do. When he got in there and he's sitting there, and the floods are raising and the deep is coming forth and everything, I just can't imagine that he understood how gracious God was to 8 people.
Right.
And I just said, the fact that you did something didn't minimize the grace of God a bit, I would think, in his mind.
Right. Really seeing the grace of God being shown to him. In thinking what seemed perhaps like an impossible task to begin, of going to accomplish that, and then to be able to step onto the ark, the Lord closing the door, and knowing as months go by, and apparently they kept track of months in terms of these things, because it does give ages, and it does give in terms of months and what day of the month it is, and going, look at what God has done. Chuck?
They had to know people that were left behind that perished in the flood, and the whole process had to make them much more keenly aware of, you know, what was the difference between them and the other people that didn't make it, you know.
Right. That big difference between those that were left behind and going, look at what God has opened up to us. What's the difference here? And how have things kind of gone out? You can kind of wonder with 365 days, trying to sum all those things up, but thinking in terms of, you might spend time thinking about the past, you might spend time thinking about the present, and you might even start to think about what's it going to be like on the other side of this, even thinking forward. Now, when you start kind of plugging these things in together, I want you to consider what seemed like an impossible task in the very beginning. I mean, to build an ark that's 450 feet long, 75 feet wide, 45 feet tall, and going, and this is the first one you've ever built, and going, and your life is bearing upon how good of a builder you are, you might think for a moment, but realizing it is by the grace of God that this is going to work. And so you start looking at those kind of tasks. I want to show you what may seem like an impossible task to us in terms of the new covenant. Look over at Ephesians chapter 3. Ephesians chapter 3. Look at verse 19. Ephesians 3:19. And to know by experience the love of Christ which surpasses knowledge, that you may be filled up to all the fullness of God. How do you consider that thought? That God is wanting to fill you up to all the fullness of who He is. You just imagine who God is. God's ability, God's character, God's strength. And here's Paul telling these saints in Ephesus, God wants to fill you up to all the fullness of who He is. Does that sound achievable to us? Does that sound near impossible? Now, we know ourselves, we know our weaknesses, we know the things we lack, and yet here is the statement of a promise that you may be filled up to all the fullness of God. You notice the may part? Are you going to have to take part in this? In the same sense that whenever Noah is given these dimensions and layout plan of going, here's what it's got to look like, here's what it's got to measure up to, and going, you're going to have to choose. Do you want to do it this way or not? It says that you may be filled up to all the fullness of God. What may seem to us as an impossible task, look at verse 20. Because that's where He's wanting us to go. Now to Him who is able to do far more abundantly beyond all that we ask or think, according to the power that works within us. Whenever it sounds impossible, who are we looking at? Ourselves, or are we looking at God? We should be looking to God, but typically when you think about being filled up to all the fullness of God, we go, man, does he know who He's dealing with here? I mess up a lot. I sin. I fail. I don't succeed as much as I'd like to. And He wants to fill me up to all the fullness of who God is. And He says, now to Him who is able to do far more abundantly beyond all that we ask or think. Do you think God can fill you up to all the fullness of who He is? Does that limit God if you don't think you can? It doesn't, does it? Now, notice this response. He says, according to the power that works within us. He's already defined exactly what this power is, or who this power is, earlier in the chapter. It's the Spirit of God at work within. And going, here's the power to draw off of, that we can be filled up to all the fullness of God. All of His character, all of His love, all of His patience, all of His kindness, all of His compassion. To walk worthy of the calling is where it's going to go next. But realizing this, when we start looking at covenant in terms of impossibility, we're looking in the wrong direction. We look at ourselves instead of looking at God. Look at His power. Look at what He does. Look at the strength His Spirit gives, as opposed to looking at our frailties. Now, when you start thinking in terms of this is new covenant promises, in the same way that Noah may have looked at that big old plan and gone, I'm glad I got time, of going, here we are going, man, I'm glad I got the Spirit of God to help. Now, so whenever you start to think in terms of the impossible, stop looking at us and start looking at God. Isn't that what Noah was doing? Was he looking, it's just me? Do you want me to do this? And then he has 3 sons. What a blessing. And then to be able to build this structure, to do it according to all God had commanded. And notice, does everything come together? Most certainly. Come back to Genesis chapter 8. Look down at verse 20. So God brings them successfully through the flood, just like He promised. They did it His way. He fulfilled His promises. He kept His covenant with Noah. Noah had a part in that covenant to honor God's commands in reverence to build the ark. Notice what Noah was thinking about while he was on the ark. Because notice the first thing he does when he gets off the ark. Look at verse 20. Genesis chapter 8, verse 20. Then Noah built an altar to the Lord and took of every clean animal and of every clean bird and offered burnt offerings on the altar. What was Noah thinking about? God. What did he know he wanted to do as soon as he got off this ark? He wanted to thank God. He wanted to honor God. Who did he recognize as bringing him safely through the flood? Was it because he could plane wood really well? Because he was good at pouring pitch? Because of his great structural mind of engineering? You notice the first thing it mentions that he does when he gets off is he builds an altar to God. Now, here's something else I want you to notice. It doesn't say God. What does it say? The capital L-O-R-D. The covenant God. What did Noah recognize? Did God keep His covenant? He says, the reason I'm standing here is because of what God has done by His covenant promise. That's how I got here. You think we're going to have a moment like that? Whenever we get to be standing in the very presence of God, by the grace of God, and realizing it wasn't because of how great I lived my life. I strive to do it His way, but that means there were still failures. And going, the only reason I get to be here is by the grace of God and the blood of His Son. And a faith response toward God to honor Him. He says, Noah built an altar to the Lord, and there's 2 things very specific about a burnt offering. Number 1, it's the idea of gratitude toward God, a gratefulness, and also this idea of dedication. Because burnt offerings were, you burn the whole thing and you offer it to God, perhaps minus the skin later on, but I'm not quite sure on here because that instruction in Leviticus hasn't been given at this point. Well, in Genesis chronology, we're Noah, that's what I'm talking about. So you see these things together and go and offered a burnt offering. Notice what moves the heart of God. Dedication to God and gratitude. You get those 2 things together in your relationship with the Lord. Dedication, I'm going to give my all to Him. I want to be filled up to all the fullness of God. And I'm grateful for what I've been given. I want you to see how this moves the heart of God. Now, it's already said before, isn't Noah a righteous man? Isn't he blameless? Isn't he faithful? And yet notice, this is the response of righteous, faithful people when they realize what God's done. Notice verse 21. The Lord smelled the soothing aroma, and the Lord said to Himself, or the Lord said to His heart, in His own heart, I will never again curse the ground on account of man, for the intent of man's heart is evil from his youth. And I will never again destroy every living thing as I have done. How did the Lord, notice the covenant God, what did he take in about Noah's offering? What was it to him? A soothing aroma. Now, set that aside for a second. Just tell me your own personal thoughts. What is a soothing aroma to you? What do you like the fragrance of? That depends on what I'm eating. Maybe some people like the smell of fresh bread or something cooking in the oven. What else is a soothing aroma to you? Flowers, meat cooking on the grill. Sound like a burnt offering there. But you start to notice there are things that are fragrant aromas, soothing aroma. Now, when you typically think in terms of something that's soothing, you maybe think of something that is comforting, something that brings about a relaxing or a peacefulness, and going, here's the Lord saying, what you're offering me in dedication and gratitude moves my heart. It's a soothing aroma to me. So what does that say about our lives in Christ? Can our lives be a fragrant aroma to God? A people who are dedicated even in the midst of difficulty? A people who are grateful, especially in terms of during the difficulty or after the difficulty's been overcome? Of going, notice how this moves the heart of God. Notice the rest of verse 21. And the Lord, the covenant God, said to himself, said to his heart, to his own heart, I will never again curse the ground on account of man. Have you noticed how many times the ground's been cursed so far through the book of Genesis? At least twice. If you remember, whenever Adam sins in the garden, he says, I'm going to curse the ground on account of you. And then whenever Cain kills Abel, he says, the ground's not going to produce for you its strength. Now we've gotten this far, what's God saying now? I'm not going to curse the ground anymore. And by the way, Noah actually means in Hebrew language rest. And that's exactly what was talked about at the end of chapter 5. There's someone who's coming to give us rest. And you go, whoa, Chuck.
I think dedication that Noah had in the light of this massive, overwhelming project, it brings it even more meaning to the word dedication.
Right.
Really what God needed out of Noah, he gave him some instructions, but I doubt that it was a detailed plan of every detail.
Right.
But once Noah began, then God was able to equip and solve all kinds of logistical problems along the way for him as he came to him. All he needed was Noah's dedication to the project.
Right. A dedication through and through. And you think in terms of our dedication to God, is it something that just requires a few days or a few weeks? What does it require? All of our lives. Now, go ahead.
There are some basics that God set out.
Certainly. Certainly.
That if Noah had decided, I don't think 450 feet is long enough, I'm going to make it 500 feet.
Right.
I don't think that would have been a soothing aroma.
Right. For sure. For sure.
If we compare this experience to our own salvation, there are details that we have to meet,
Right.
and we can't do it on our own. Those details are set by God.
And that's part of the truth aspect of going. We have to apply that truth in terms of the way we're living and what we're doing. So you take notice here. He says, I'll never again curse the ground on account of man. Do you see how the heart of God is affected here? He says, for the intent of man's heart is evil from his youth. Now notice it doesn't say from his birth. It says from his youth. He says, and I will never again destroy every living thing as I have done. Is there a concerning about another worldwide flood? Now here's something that's a little unique. Is he saying this to Noah? He's saying this to himself. But notice something else here. Verse 22. While the earth remains, what does that tell you? There's going to be an end. Even at this point, he's already said, while the earth remains, there's going to be a time where it won't. He says, seed time and harvest, and cold and heat, and summer and winter, and day and night shall not cease. Here's what God is declaring and going, there's going to be a time to plant and a time to harvest. He says, there's going to be cold and heat. Don't we have fluctuation in that nearly every day? In some sense. He says, summer and winter, seasons, right? Then he says, and day and night. I mean, don't you have that in every 24 hours? He says, these things aren't going to cease. He says, these things are going to keep on going. Then notice chapter 9, verse 1. And here's something else to maybe consider. He talked about in verse 21, I'll never again curse the ground on account of man. Who stands in control of the soil and the vegetation? God does. If you think in terms of verse 22, who stands in control of the weather and the seasons? God does. Chapter 9 opens up. Notice how it continues. And God blessed Noah and his sons and said to them, now here's the statements toward Noah and his sons. He says, be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth. Have we ever heard that statement before? Oh, yeah. That's way back there in Genesis chapter 1, right? Are you starting to see things just like we're going through some similar patterns here, right? Because whenever man and woman are placed in the garden, has the ground been cursed? No. You think, all right, there's vegetation, okay. Then here you get something a little bit new and a little bit different, but he says, be fruitful, multiply, and fill the earth. I mean, nothing like, the first time it said the population of the earth is 2. Well, guess what? Population of the earth now is, well, this should be a whole lot easier. We got 8 of us now. But he says, be fruitful, multiply, and fill the earth. Then comes verse 2. He says, the fear of you and the terror of you will be on every beast of all the earth and on every bird of the sky with everything that creeps on the ground and all the fish of the sea. Into your hand they are given. What has changed? Relationship with the animals. Who controls the thinking of animals? God does. Now consider that thought for a minute. Because there's so many times you go, that's just the natural instincts of these animals. Who put the natural instinct in them? God did. Now, here's the aspect of something that's changed. Now there's a fear and a terror within the animals, and if you notice the listing, every beast of the earth, every bird of the sky, everything that creeps on the ground, all the fish of the sea. Isn't it interesting? It brings up the fish. They weren't on the ark. He says they're going to be affected too. He says, into your hand they are given. Oh, what? That's new. Because what were they eating before? This is all vegetations and fruit, right? Now you see things making a different turn here. Now, notice something else here. Verse 3 clears it up in case we were wondering. Every moving thing that is alive shall be food for you. I give all to you as I gave the green plant. Oh, you mean the dietary structure has now changed? Not just vegetarian anymore? Now we can eat meat. Here's something else that I think is a little unique. Notice how he doesn't divide it up and say, okay, you can only eat the clean animals. At this point in time, everything is wide open. Now, here's another aspect of this. How long in advance did God know that there was going to be a flood to destroy every living being on earth except for those he would spare? Before he created it. Because look at what he said in order. Animals don't eat each other. Man doesn't eat animals. Animals are at peace with man. You ever had people ask you those questions of going, how could they all be on the ark and all of a sudden the lions not eat the lambs and have all these things about, boy, I don't know how many days I'd be on the ark. I'd be saying, what, a steak sure sounds nice right now. But you realize they're all questions that don't make any sense, do they? Because everything's eating the green herb. Man doesn't eat meat until this point right here, which tells you God already knew. He knew what was inside of man. He knew what man was going to do. He knew what a man of faith would do. And you see him lay out these things for a one-time judgment. Now, why do you think he wanted to teach us all about a judgment like this? Why? Show his power? To learn from it. What do we need to learn from this? Is there going to be a judgment? Does it matter? It certainly does. Now, if you notice the point here, he says, every moving thing that's alive will be food for you. I give all to you as I gave the green plant. Verse 4, but there is some things we need to address. He says, only you shall not eat flesh with its life, that is, its blood. He says, but here's something in particular. He says, the blood is not yours. You can eat of any animal, but you cannot eat the blood. That's my portion, not yours. Now, here's another thought for you. I'll just share this on the side, and I don't want to go down the rabbit hole with it, but when you start thinking big picture, because people have all kinds of questions when it comes to the ark and it comes to these kind of things. And people think in terms of, if you start looking at the skeletal remains of dinosaurs, if you look at their teeth, you have some that it looks like they were probably herbivores. You also have some that look like they were what? Carnivores. They ate meat. If dinosaurs ate meat, were they on the ark? When could they start to eat meat? Not till after the flood, right? Now, you start thinking your way through some of these questions that you come up with and realize, did God prepare a way for these things to work out very easily? It's like they may have teeth structure like that, but they're not eating any vegetation. They're just eating vegetation until you get to Genesis chapter 9, right? And you start looking through, all these species on the ark, does it ever say that the species that came to Noah, remember, God had them come to Noah to load them on the ark? Or they all have to be full grown? Nope. Just 7 pairs of the clean and 4 pairs of the unclean, or 2 pairs of the unclean. You realize all those things work within this scripture that we have, right? There's no stretch here, is it? It's all right in front of us. So, when you get here to verse 4, he says, only you shall not eat flesh with its life, that is its blood. He says, there's definitely a portion that's not for you. He says, the blood's not yours. Verse 5, surely I will require your lifeblood. From every beast I will require it, and from every man's brother I will require the life of man. Now, remember what the big problem was before this ark trip? What was filling the earth? Violence. What's God saying here? Is he going to be okay with violence? He says, if you're going to take the life of someone else, what's it going to cost you to take their life? Yours. He says, don't think that violence is going to be tolerated the same way anymore. Now, notice specifically the reason why violence is being taken out. Verse 6. He says, whoever sheds man's blood, by man his blood shall be shed. For in the image of God he made man. So why is bloodshed being outlawed? What's the motive? because they're made in my image. Now, when you take that to heart, you think that still affects us now? Think God's still going in the same direction? If you're going to be violent and take someone else's life, to go, here's God saying, you killed someone who's made in my image. Now, you also notice, would it be okay to take their life? Because look at what he's talking about. What's going to be required of them? Their life. Now, it's not something you can just go around and go, oh, you killed anybody yet? So I know if I can kill you or not. But realizing, he's saying, look, violence is not what I desire. And you need to recognize whose image you're made in. And you also need to recognize who everybody else's image that you're made in. Now, look at verse 7. He says, as for you, be fruitful and multiply, populate the earth abundantly and multiply in it. Now he says abundance. Then, we've heard this before, verse 8. I'm going to be a little funny here, but hang on with me. Then God spoke to Noah and to his sons with him, saying, who's God talked to? Noah and his sons. Who does he not talk to? All right, here's where I'm going to be just a little bit of shade of funny, maybe. Husbands. Have you ever had somebody give you information and then you go to tell your wife what you've been told? Do you ever get asked any more questions after you've shared what you wanted to share? Did they say that this is what it was? Are you sure it's not this way? Now, I say that just as a generality, but I want you to understand. Look at these next few verses and understand all the questions that would be asked, perhaps, and to see the answers are here. God spoke to Noah and to his sons with him, saying, verse 9, now behold, I myself do establish my covenant with you and with your descendants after you. Is this covenant just for us or is this for anybody else? This covenant is for your descendants after you. Are you sure this is a covenant or is this just a promise? God said it's a covenant. It's his covenant. And this covenant's going to be unique. This covenant's really not like any other covenant that I know of in Scripture. Because this one's not dependent upon man. It's not dependent upon man at all. The covenant that God gave to Noah, Noah had to respond out of faith. The covenant that God gave to Adam, in terms of not to eat of the fruit that's of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, Adam had to respond out of faith not to do it. But he broke the covenant because he didn't show faith. You realize, here's a covenant where God's putting forward, and you'll see as we go, it is not dependent upon a response by man. This is just flat out God's covenant. This is his promise. Then, he says, I myself do establish my covenant with you and with your descendants after you. Verse 10, and with every living creature that is with you, the birds, the cattle, and every beast of the earth with you, of all that comes out of the ark, even every beast of the earth. Is this covenant for every animal or just some animals? Every animal that came out of the ark. There you go. Then, verse 11, I establish my covenant with you, and all flesh shall never again be cut off by the water of the flood, neither shall there again be a flood to destroy the earth. He says, do you have to worry about keeping this ark up to speed and ready to launch at all times? Nope. He says, don't have to worry about this thing. You can let it go the way of all earth. Now, notice again, he says, I establish my covenant with you, but it's also with your descendants, and it's also with every species of animal that comes off of the ark. Then he's going to take it another way, saying, I'm never again going to cut off by water the flood. It says, neither again is going to be a flood to destroy the whole earth. Verse 12, God said, this is the sign of the covenant which I am making between me and you and every living creature that is with you for all successive generations. Oh, this is not just multiple generations. This is every generation. This is for as long as the earth remains. This is always going to be in place. What kind of peace does this offer Noah and his sons? Oh, man. You mean we're not going to have to go through this process again? We don't have to worry about rinse and repeat? I mean, what he brings up here, he says, I'm going to give you a sign of my covenant so that you will know. He says, and this is going to be for every living creature. It's for me, it's for you, the four of you, and all the descendants after you, which of course is going to include their wives. He says, every generation. Verse 13, I set my bow in the cloud, and it shall be for a sign of a covenant between me and the earth. Now he doesn't just include you, every generation to come, every species of animal that came off of the ark. Now he says, my covenant is with planet Earth. I'm not going to destroy this whole thing again. I mean, do we typically think of God making a covenant with His creation? Do you see what I mean in terms of, have you noticed through here it's not based upon, now as long as y'all do what I command, this is a unique covenant. It's a unique covenant of God of saying, you need to know for sure, I'm never going to destroy this place again by water. I'm never going to utterly wipe this thing out again. He says, my covenant is with the earth, it's with you, it's with your generations, it's with your descendants, every successive generation, every living creature that's on the earth. He says, I set my bow in the cloud. Now, I'm going to take it for granted that everybody in here has seen at least one rainbow in your life. And I'm going to assume you've probably seen a whole bunch. At the same time, if you notice it, I went ahead and even looked up the definition. I'm dumb sometimes. And they go, well, what's the definition of a cloud? A visible mass of condensed water vapor floating in the atmosphere, typically high above the ground. If you want to do the science of rainbows, it's about sunlight coming in at a certain angle, whether it be in the morning or in the evening, and it's passing through and reflecting the water vapor. The spectrum of light that comes in, and because of the way the water vapor is, it separates out that beam of light into what we would probably say Roy G. Biv. And you go, he says, it's in the cloud. It's in this vapor. And you go, how did Moses know all the signs? Because God told him to write it down. And this is what God said. I'm going to set my bow in the cloud. And it'll be a sign of a covenant between me and the earth. Is that what we always think about when we see rainbows? I'm amazed at how many people love just taking pictures of rainbows. I think it's wonderful. But I've very, very seldom ever seen anybody talk about God's covenant relationship and the covenant God. Here's something else for us. These events that we're reading about with Noah took place some 4,500 years ago. How long has God been keeping this covenant? Over 450 centuries. How good are we at keeping promises? You want to be filled up to all the fullness of God? What do we better start to pay attention to? Our promises. Are we people who are going to keep our word? Whether if it's a parent to a child, whether if it's a husband to a wife or a wife to a husband, whether it's a promise to your neighbor or your enemy. You notice about God, how is He at keeping promises? Flawless. Flawless. That should tell us who we need to be as God's people. When we give our word, we had better think about it to carry it out. And it had better be something within our means to do. Is God able to keep this promise? We're still here. And we haven't been destroyed by the flood of water, have we? Now, notice how this continues. He goes on. He says, verse 16. Well, actually, verse 14. He says, it shall come about when I bring a cloud over the earth that the bow will be seen in the cloud. And I will remember my covenant, which is between me and you and every living creature of all flesh. And never again shall the water become a flood to destroy all flesh. He says, I'm giving you this sign so that you know I will remember my covenant. He says, it's not like God's going to forget and go, oh, that's right, rainbow's in the sky, I can't destroy you again. He's saying, the rainbow is there so that you know that I'm going to remember my covenant. I'm not going to forget. We might forget, but He won't. Then, verse 16, he says, when the bow is in the cloud, then I will look upon it to remember the everlasting covenant between God and every living creature of all flesh that is on the earth. And God said to Noah, notice, where'd the sons go? I don't know. But he makes this statement to Noah specifically. This is the sign of the covenant which I have established between me and all flesh that is on the earth. He says, this is my promise to you. Now, if you notice these covenant responsibilities in terms of it's all on God's side on this one, but yet the fact that we're still here shows He's faithful to His promise. Now, it's something, you start looking down through things and going, is that where we have resigned ourselves to be? In terms of going, in this covenant specifically with the rainbow, it is solely based upon God. Yet the covenant that God had with Noah and the ark, it did have some dependency upon Noah. You're going to have to respond out of faith. In the same sense with our new covenant that we have through Jesus with God, we're going to have to respond out of faith and go, and we have to hold to Him with everything. All right, Chuck.
Seems like usually when you see the rainbow, the rain is over.
It can be. It can be just about to come, too. It goes both ways. All right, have a great week. We'll pick up there next week.